Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Shared Purpose Over Silos. We are so happy that you all made the effort to get up and join us bright and early this morning. This topic feels especially relevant for the group that we have here at Mackinac, business leaders, nonprofit, and public policymakers, because we know that lasting change rarely happens in isolation. When organizations work across sectors to coordinate around the full needs of individuals and families, we can reduce barriers, strengthen communities, and create more durable pathways to opportunity. Our discussion today goes beyond individual programs. It speaks to how we design systems that are more aligned, more effective, and ultimately more equitable. The insights shared here have important implications for how we think about policy, investment, and cross-sector collaboration moving forward. At Delta Dental, we're proud to sponsor this session because we understand that the factors influencing health extend far beyond the dental chair. Stable housing, economic stability, behavioral health support, and strong community systems all shape a person's ability to care for their overall health, which of course includes oral health. If someone's worried about where they'll sleep, how they'll support their family, or how they'll access services, dental care may understandably fall far down their priority list, if it even makes the list at all. That's why we invest in partnerships that address the social determinants of health and support whole person, community-based solutions that can improve outcomes not only for individuals, but for Michigan as a whole. We're fortunate to be joined by a distinguished group of leaders doing this work every day. Our moderator, Margaret Trimmer, is Vice President of Strategic Partnerships for Delta Dental of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, where she leads marketing, public relations, internal culture, and corporate philanthropy. She's joined by Ryan Hertz, President and CEO of Lighthouse, whose work has expanded housing, shelter, and support services for thousands across Metro Detroit. Aubrey Macfarlane, President and CEO of Volunteers of America, Michigan, is a longtime leader at the intersection of healthcare, housing, and human services. And last but not least, Sean Defor, President and CEO of MiSide Community Impact Network, who's led innovative, integrated approaches spanning behavioral health, housing, economic stability, and early childhood programs. Margaret, I'll turn it over to you and the panel.
Thank you, Carmen. And thank you for getting up early. And just remember, a small, mighty group of people who are committed to the cause is greater than 1,000 people who really are in it without much skin. So thank you for being that small and mighty group. And also know that we, at this time slot, we do struggle to pull people into the room, but we are one of the most popular downloaded sessions after people get home and go back and reflect on their week. So I'm excited about the opportunity to share this conversation far and wide. But I'm going to start with a slight reflection to set the scene here. I explored the organizations represented up here and their websites deeply before preparing for this session. And one quote really stuck out for me, and it was on the VOA website. Very simple. Home is more than a roof over your head, right? Home is where we get nourishment, spiritual, physical. Home is where we build our lives, build our families, build our dreams. Home is where we love. We love our people. Home is where we rest and replenish ourselves for the journey ahead, for the next difficult day, right? And that reminded me, rest, of a really interesting conversation I had at a mattress shop recently. Needed a new mattress. And have you noticed how expensive mattresses are? And I was talking to the manager of the mattress store. And he said, yeah, people come in and they think they can get a mattress for $200 or $300. It's more like $2,000 these days. And he said, you know, sleep is a necessity. I think mattresses ought to be free for everybody. Like sleep is a human right. And I thought, this is just an average guy in an average job who understands fundamentally what it means to succeed and what some of the necessities of success actually are. A good night's sleep, right? And a home and a house is fundamental to that. So today we're talking about silos and those who operate outside of them. The three people represented here today don't work in silos, and that's why their work is so extraordinarily unique. We've spent decades building systems based around categories: housing, food, mental health, etc., as though people live in boxes, categories, or silos, and they don't, right? They live holistically. So today's conversation is about what happens when organizations stop asking, well, what program do you qualify for? And start asking, what does this person actually need to thrive? So opening question for each of you. The title of this session is Shared Purpose Over Silos. And before we dive into solutions, what's broken about the siloed approach? What are people actually experiencing when our systems fail to connect holistically? Sean, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I always say that people are not one-dimensional, and neither are their problems. And part of what brought two nonprofit organizations together to form MiSide in 2023 was that we kept seeing people showing up with the same core set of needs over and over and over. Behavioral health and healthcare issues, access to affordable, high-quality housing, neighborhood safety and stability where they lived, the ability to increase their income so that they were earning a living wage. And we decided that we couldn't continue to just treat problems, we had to actually treat people. And the best way to do that was to see the person that was sitting in front of us, understand their full collection of needs, and then make sure that we are providing services to meet all of those needs. Because when we don't do that, what we're doing is we're giving people just enough services to not remain in crisis, but not enough services to actually remain stable in the long term and thrive. And when we shortchange people, we're also shortchanging the communities that they live in, so this will continue on in perpetuity. So real change only happens when we work across silos and integrate all those programs to see the person and not the problem.
It kind of reminds me of how if you are suffering from an acute healthcare issue and you go to the ER, you get treated for that acute problem, and then you're told you got to see your family physician on the other side, and so many people don't. Yeah. So they're back in the emergency room for the same old stuff, right?
Right. That's
similar
exactly
comparison.
Yeah.
Aubrey, how are you looking at this holistically?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges when the system's broken is that it often takes a lot for someone to ask for help, or for someone to reach out and say, I've identified this challenge and my goal is to get here. How do I get there? And when we operate in silos, we create a space where people have to repeat their story over and over again. And it's often a challenging story and sometimes a traumatizing story. And we create this exhaustion and sometimes an exacerbation of what's happening within that person's life, personal life, family life, by having them go from the next space to the next space and tell the story again. And so similar to Sean, we've created programs where we're bringing people together. One example is we are doing these projects in the city of Detroit where we're bringing everybody who touches a veteran who's homeless, right? So Secretary of State helping them to get driver's license, landlords, the VA, mental health providers, anybody who can service this veteran to one space, so that when the veteran says, I need help, they can only tell their story once, and then that case management person is going to help them take through the chain. And they're working on making that a national model because it's not only been so successful at keeping those people headed toward their goals, but also for us helping them to look at housing permanency and look at that in a shortened time frame. So by having everyone in the same space, this quality of care is enhanced, but also the time frame and access to a home and a place to lay their head as well.
How hard was it to make that shift, to pull everybody from the service space into the room at one time? How hard?
So it wasn't that difficult once relationships were built. So we had a leader who built great relationships and pulled everyone into a room to say, where are the gaps? What is the problem? And how can we collectively solve that? And then I think the first event, people probably questioned how successful it was going to be. But when we saw changes in the time frame in people accessing housing, changes by 90 days in some spaces. Sometimes we were turning around people within a week to get access to housing. People were really sold on the idea. So it takes being able to really show the data and the ROI to these projects, and then people are fully bought in.
Ryan, when we talked about this conversation this morning, and I said, it's about wraparound services, it's about breaking down silos, you said, wait, I thought we were talking about housing. But then you said the word proximity. Talk a little bit about how the silos don't exist if you look at things in that proximity, through that proximity lens.
Well, first, thanks for having us here, Margaret, and bringing together such a great group of folks. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. I think one of the things that we all have in common with each other is that we are organizations that probably were not originally, in fact, I'm pretty sure, originally organized around the issue of housing. We're here together because we all touch housing, but none of us were organized around the issue of housing. All of us were organized around serving the needs of people for whom not just the system of service for acute situations was broken, but for whom the broader economy was not meeting their needs, and the people for whom failings in our system caused them to need to seek our assistance. And as all of us, apart from one another, MiSide, I believe, starting with mental health, VOA, I don't even...
Start with veterans.
Well, that would make sense. And at Lighthouse, starting originally as a food pantry, that as we look upstream, all of us landed on housing. So while it's true that you can't look at housing as an isolated thing to solve for housing, housing is a really strong leverage point when you look at what fails people. There's a reason we all end up landing on housing. It's because as we continue to look upstream for the people that come to us for emergency food, emergency shelter, I guess the housing connection there may be a little bit more obvious. But as you continue to look upstream, you eventually hit this issue of housing, having it at all, its proximity to opportunity, to social networks that allow people generationally to overcome poverty, and quality of housing. To your point about being able to have access to a mattress is so fundamental, right? To be able to have access to the ability to rest, the ability to retreat, the ability to show up and contribute to the community. And I think that we can't look at it in isolation, but I think we can't understate the significance of poor planning around housing.
It seems in a lot of sectors, healthcare, education, and now really helping people who are underserved, that the language tells us a lot about our evolution. So health started with healthcare, moved to wellness. Now we're talking about well-being. There seems to be a need to individualize, and individualize in systems that are trying to deal with masses is really difficult. You talk about we have to see that person, we have to understand their story individually. How do you do it? That is labor intensive. And wild card question, one that we didn't talk about, but that's been talked about throughout this conference is there a role for AI to help us sort and streamline and become more efficient in seeing individuals? Aubrey, why don't you tackle that one?
I think there is absolutely a role for AI, and we're probably a little bit behind the ball with AI. We are looking at a whole person, right? And we are looking at well-being as defining health. And within that, there are different technologies that we can use. We are operating with an organization called Ping Cares that is providing watches for a number of our veterans and our seniors and folks who are living independently. And the goal is, of course, to maintain that independence over time, but this can gather data, analyze data, and provide themes and trends to folks that are in an office doing case management. So it's a trigger to seeing changes in behavior that might be concerning. But I think that we need to look at that direction because, of course, what we're looking at is the intensity of need when you are looking at a whole person is a lot, right? We're looking at substance use, mental health, medical health, physical health, all of the above. And if I look at my life, I could think any day I need a case manager, right? So certainly other folks do too, but that takes a lot of time, which is why I need that. And so if we can use technology to help leverage how to make us be able to serve more people, that's going to be essential moving forward.
Ryan, I know you're on this point because when we first met, I met your AI assistant. And this was years ago.
Yeah.
At least a couple years ago.
Hal, yeah.
And I didn't recognize, because I'm not like a Star Wars or whatever fan. You named him.
Hal 9000.
Yeah, right. I should have known, right? That was a
Different movie,
reference.
but
But
yeah.
I'm talking to Hal, and I'm like, what's wrong with this assistant? This is not a human, and it wasn't. But it was very efficient, and it was very smart. So where in the world of case management and such are you
You
using?
actually inspired me to, I think you were the first person to point out and say, you should really tell people when you loop in your AI assistant and
I
it's
did.
AI, because you had gotten into a back and forth. Yeah, so on the topic
Gentle
of AI,
counsel.
that was funny. That was almost 5 years ago, 4 years ago. On the topic of AI, I think the way that folks in our sector are responding to AI, I'm setting aside how we can utilize the tools in our day-to-day and how we serve people. I think that there's a general attitude of fear because we serve people, again, that the economy sort of misses, people that aren't able to find opportunity that provides them an income that's able to help them sustain. And the threat in our social discourse of AI is it's going to replace jobs. And if AI replaces jobs, we're going to have more people, especially if you're in organizations that are responding to issues of basic sustenance. You're going to have more people who have more need, and you're going to have less resources to respond. I think the reason why we react that way is because we look around and we can see that our society today does not actually reflect our core values in the way that we would hope, meaning that the fact that we have such abundance and we still have hundreds of thousands of people in this country that are unhoused is an indicator to us of that means we will fail everybody when their jobs are replaced. And the reason I think we think that's the case is because we've become so accustomed to prioritizing the value of individual productivity above and beyond so many other values that we all share that we just simply need to remember and elevate, such as looking out for one another, the basic dignity and value of a person regardless of their productivity. We actually do have the potential to take tools like AI and utilize them to increase quality of life. In order to do that, we have to remember that our purpose is not strictly collective productivity. And when we think about the people that we serve at Lighthouse, once we flip that switch, we go from serving a stigmatized population who might feel a lot of shame having to come to us for services into saying, no, this is actually an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to reflect our values, to look out for one another, and actually live into our highest purpose. Which is not just productivity, but is actually selflessness and care for another person.
Some people might debate you on those values.
I sometimes go back and forth with Hal 9000 on this.
Well, that would be an interesting fly on the wall to witness. Sean, add anything that you can on the AI piece, but then also we talk about collaboration and collective work as though it's easy. And you brought people together, Aubrey, and you found there was some suspicion. How do we truly get people to understand the power and the value of doing this work together? Donors get it. We can't stand when there's this cannibalization for resources going on. We love to see collaboration. So hit on anything AI that you can add, and then let's talk about the real, raw, hard work of collaborating.
Yeah, and it's, I don't want to understate the challenge of helping people understand the importance of that collaboration and the interconnectedness that we have between all these different systems. Even in my own organization, where we have these 4 pillars of behavioral health and early childhood and affordable housing and economic self-sufficiency, I have to spend a lot of my time helping my staff understand why it's so important to look across the aisle at the others. because it's those in-betweens where people fall through the cracks, and it's in those in-between spaces where I think difference really happens. So let me go back to your question about AI, because you started by saying that this approach of looking at the whole person can be cumbersome. And you're right, it is. But what people don't understand is it might be a little bit cumbersome up front, but it saves a lot of costs and is much more efficient in the long run. So for example, we have started, no matter what MiSide door somebody comes through, we do a social determinants of health screening on every consumer customer that comes through a MiSide door. It's 20 questions, and it helps us identify needs that they have that the problem that brought them to us may not necessarily make visible. And once we have completed that assessment, then it is that person's responsibility to connect that consumer with other services that they may need. This is where AI can come into play, right? And we're trying to figure out how to build AI into our CRM system, so when that social determinants of health screening is done, referrals are automatically made to people that we know can help meet that person's need, and then the person doesn't have to touch it. As we get more efficient with AI, I think people will find that that screening tool and those referrals won't take any time, because it'll happen automatically. So that's number one. Number two, we have to spend a lot of time, not just with funders, but with systems, helping them understand the cost burden when we don't look at the whole person, right? Think about supportive housing, and we have housing as a common link among us. When you place somebody in supportive housing that is affordable, their visits to the emergency department drop by about 30%.
Yeah.
Right? The cost that we pay for somebody who's on Medicaid and supportive housing drops by 18% when they're in stable, affordable housing. So we had Bob Riney on the stage the other day talking about healthcare costs. We had Superintendent Vitti on the stage in a session talking about the additional expense of educating a child who is living in poverty and who is unhoused, right? Every system suffers when we don't look at a whole person and all of their needs and only look at a portion. And as systems start to understand that, then they want to make the investment to understand what all these person's needs are, not just one.
So that's a perfect segue to let's talk about what's happening in the policy arena.
Yeah.
That either is positive and hopeful or that stands in your way. And Ryan, are you dealing with policy problems?
No, never. Of course. You know, I think to Sean's point about the incredible cost savings available when you focus on particular leverage points like housing. One of our biggest challenges is that it's not clear and obvious that there's an ROI in one place that justifies that investment, right? And that's where public policy really can shine, right? Is to say, look at across our sectors, the incredible cost savings to ensuring nobody is unhoused, ensuring those that we provide housing to are proximate to work and opportunity, which includes opportunity to work, includes social opportunity in order to connect, includes education of the children in those households. Look at all of the ROI that we're getting as a society, but maybe the emergency room in that particular community doesn't get quite enough to write the check for everybody's rent, right? How do we connect those dots and elevate them? And right now, the policy challenges that we're facing, frankly, are that at the local and state level, we're actually doing a great job, I think, but the vast majority of resources connected to housing for folks who fall through the cracks flows through the federal government. Whether that's tax credits, IRS tax credits used for the production of housing, whether that's supportive services dollars and rental assistance dollars flowing through HUD. These are policies that we do not have the resource base at the local or state level today, nor the political will to generate to replace. And there's a lot of policy argument looking at narratives that we believe about each other when we think about productivity of the individual that say, well, if we provide people rental assistance ongoing, they don't have any skin in the game, right? we have to have a cliff where that ends in order for that person to recognize their need to contribute and to succeed. It's a really, actually, unfortunately, cynical view of humans that we need the threat of destitution in order to want to contribute to our community, right? The reality is that most of these dollars are going to support people who are chronically homeless before they receive those resources, to whom the threat of destitution did not inspire productivity. In fact, made it much harder for them to participate in the economy and just really compounded any disabilities they might be facing, any co-occurring issues of substance abuse, et cetera. And those that we do make these investments in, we see time and time again, the data shows success. So if we look at the broader population and say, you know, the policies at the national level around housing first have been unsuccessful because we have a larger population of homelessness than we've ever had in this country, those people are not the people receiving that intervention. Those are the people we have not been able to provide it to because we haven't made large enough investments in housing. And so we are at a significant risk right now of going very far in the wrong direction if we don't really look at a more nuanced level, what are we going to miss if we say, because we haven't made enough investments to date, let's throw some other things at the wall, instead of really saying, what has worked at the individual level, at the community level, at the local level, and how do we invest in it to ensure that it's at the scale necessary to actually respond to the problem?
Policy issues?
So let me inject some hopefulness in the policy environment that I see. One is the Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic model. So we're a large behavioral health provider. There's support for this in the House and Senate at the federal side, and we're a part of this model. What's great about the CCBHC, Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic, is it's an integrated approach to behavioral health, right? It requires that we provide physical health care alongside behavioral health care, that we serve veterans, that we serve anybody regardless of their insurance or lack thereof. Basically, there are no barriers to getting treatment when somebody needs a mental health support. And it's models like that that are more integrated that I think we're starting to see pop up in various places that are being supported by policy that we need to continue to advance. Same is true in housing, right? I was in a conversation with somebody yesterday about a state affordable housing credit that will help advance the development of affordable housing in the state. If it's passed, it's being introduced in the House and the Senate in Michigan. And I hope that the folks here will support it, and I hope that it passes, because it's the development of affordable housing and the supports that are built into that affordable housing that allows us to provide wraparound services in proximity to where people are, where it's needed. So I think there's a lot of hope in the policy space, and the more we can see these integrated kinds of approaches supported by policy, I think the better off we're all going to be.
We needed that dose of hope. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Aubrey, with your specific and unique focus on veterans, you serve others, but the veteran piece is huge. What about policy as it relates to our veterans? I mean, we heard Gary Sinise talk yesterday about, you know, his passion and why he's so driven to support veterans. We don't take care of our vets very well.
Yeah, it really is a challenge, and there's a current legislative agenda to allow veterans to be assigned guardianship, and it goes back to some of the fundamental challenges that Ryan was talking about. You know, assigning a veteran guardianship because they're homeless really strips them of their independence. And so for us, that's really top of mind right now regarding policy. But I think in the big picture, we're seeing this constriction of funds around permanent supportive housing. There was a threat around veterans that hasn't come to fruition now. There's certainly a threat around Medicaid and introducing work requirements for Medicaid, all around this kind of fundamental misconception that, again, if we reach destitution, people will start to contribute, not really realizing who are we talking, like what is the face of Medicaid, right? It's often people who are working full-time and aren't making a wage, certainly to afford housing and definitely not to afford healthcare. So there's this misperception that's been linked to fraud, waste, and abuse within the nonprofit arena. And I'll speak to a little bit of a different point than my colleagues, and what can we do as a nonprofit industry? We are not really good about sharing ROI. We're really great at sharing stories, but what that doesn't translate to is if I don't intervene at a whole person quality of life level, the cost to taxpayers is this. And so you see it as an exorbitant cost to help me intervene with this person who has said, I need some support. But if I don't do that, the cost is tenfold. And we don't talk about that. We are busy in the streets, talking to people, trying to figure out what communities need, but don't on the other side show the data and link that to taxpayer cost savings. And so I think in a political forum, we collectively need to do a better job sharing the absolutely fundamental nature of the work that we do in communities.
So I have noticed, and I'm sure others have too, there are a whole lot more people at the freeway entrance ramps with their signs, and more people that meet us in cities you wouldn't expect. East Lansing, Okemos. I see folks, and I'm pretty progressive. I'm pretty willing to go up and talk to people, but we don't. We don't see them. We see them, but we don't see them. And I think that may be part of the policy and collective action problem is we're almost afraid. We feel so awkward, and there's such a history of drug abuse, and you don't want to give a quarter, a dollar, $10 to someone who you think is going to just go and use it for purposes that we wouldn't want. How can we, as humans who care, behave differently in our communities when we see homeless people? What is productive and what is not productive? Ryan, jump in.
I have a lot of thoughts. One is, while data is certainly important and it for sure helps us make thoughtful investment, it's been my experience that even in the face of data that shows really clear return on investment, people tend to resort to stories. They do, not just in terms of how we communicate externally, but in what fundamentally drives the electorate to enable efficient policy. People do resort to stories. So when people think about homelessness, they think about their own experiences and the stories they've heard and the assumptions that they've made about who is homeless, why are they homeless, what might happen if I empower them, not just with some money or maybe a sandwich I might have in my car when I'm at the intersection, but what might happen if we empower homeless people at large with more resources, right? And so I think it's important to have other stories. Yes, data's part of those stories, but fundamentally what we're trying to do is help people think differently about each other, I think. And so when we think about what somebody might do that might be destructive with resources we give them, we have to remind ourselves that actually people across the economic spectrum do destructive things with resources that we give them, whether it's because they earn those resources at a job or anywhere else. And it may be the case that somebody who's experienced generational poverty has a whole lot more to overcome when it comes to whatever those barriers are. But that fundamentally actually investing in people and equipping people and believing in people has an ROI, no matter who that person is. A story that I recall that's been life-changing for me was actually in one of those experiences where I pulled up to an intersection. I didn't have any money on me. I had a business card on me, and I was running a homeless shelter at the time, and I handed the gentleman the business card, and a couple weeks later, I walked into the office, and he was in the waiting room in our office, and he thanked me, and he ended up exiting our shelter into housing, permanent supportive housing. He had been physically and mentally disabled for a long period of time, and a couple weeks later. And so we have to keep going, right? We have to, yes, housing, but we have to keep going. We have to help find ways to empower people to have a vocation, not because they're a drag on us, but for their own dignity, for their own well-being, for their own life.
Sean, what can we do? How do we react?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan 100%. I think the first thing I would encourage people to do is just remember, there but for the grace of God go I. In the United States, 40% of Americans don't have the savings to be able to weather a $400 emergency. We are all, most of us in the United States, much closer to suffering homelessness because of a crisis than we are to becoming millionaires. So when I see someone who's in those circumstances, I remember that that could very easily be me, that could be one of my kids, that could be one of my parents. You never know. We're all in pretty precarious situations. So I think the response, number one, is not to judge, but number two is to support policies, going back to the policy question, support candidates, support efforts at the state and federal level that ensure equitable access for everybody to affordable housing, and a safety net that supports people so in times of crisis they can remain stable and remain housed, right? We had somebody that we supported, thank you, we had somebody that we supported in our housing counseling program. 70-year-old woman had been living in her house for over 40 years, and during COVID, she got COVID, and she got sick. And she ended up having to spend money for a home health provider that her insurance did not fully pay for. And as a result, she had to skip her mortgage payment for a few months and fell behind, and other bills piled on. And then she was facing foreclosure on her home that she had lived in for 40 years. She would have been out on the street were it not for our program that helped her restructure that loan. Right. It could be anybody. It could be you tomorrow, it could be me today. Don't forget that and support policies that make sure people are supported.
Well, and we're here by accident of birth, right? You know, what a privilege. Anything to add, Aubrey?
I was going to go the same direction Sean goes. I always start with, you know, you have to remember you are one decision or one incident away from homelessness. And people don't realize that homelessness is really that accessible. It's true. And, you know, the stories we hear of people who worked on the line at Ford for 40 years, retired, maybe invested money in something that fell to the wayside, and all of their life savings are gone, and they're currently in our affordable housing sites. We have another gentleman who ended up graduating with his PhD. I mean, these are folks who have life goals. But I think that the way we approach folks is, again, that lens of not judgment, but also knowing that in order to honor a human, we have to honor what their wishes are, right? Sometimes folks aren't ready to leave homelessness, and that's okay. And there are shelter services that can help people stay warm and that can have a few meals and they can take a shower. That's great. There are others who want to transition from that. And so really honoring the human and what their goals are in a relational way is how we're successful in the work we do.
So let's fast forward. Let's look at a beautiful world 5 years from now. What would be an ideal, what would be a success for us systematically in this sector of work? Paint that picture. So we've got the promised land and we know where we're going. Aubrey, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think convergence of funding sources around a lot of the unique programming we're doing, really having an investment in the dollars to treat a person holistically. So having that conversion of service providers along with the funders, right? We as a system have to look at this from an abundance theory. You know, we all went into this work, and I remember saying in my graduate studies in social work at U of M, like, I want to change the world, right? And my professor was like, oh goodness, she's young and spicy. But I think we can do that by being willing to work on this intersection where we drop our egos at the door to say, we went into this to work ourselves out of a job. So if I'm too focused on my organization only and how I define my work that we do, I'm not going to be successful at truly meeting community need. There are other partners that do pieces of the work better than we do. And so how do we drop the ego at the door to figure out this is the community need, we know collectively this is the solution, and we can only do that collectively together to get to that solution.
Ryan?
That's pretty good. I don't know if I can follow that. Well, I'm going to actually go back to our conversation about AI and technology for a second and say 5 years from now is actually a really long time when you think about the fact that it was less than 5 years ago that you were surprised by my scheduling assistant, which predates large language models, right? We're in a time where we have to start thinking about human dignity differently. And for a long time, our sector has been sort of corralled into a focus on the concept of self-sufficiency. because the assumption has been that the services that we provide, the assistance that we provide, the assistance that the state provides is in some way only meant to be a bridge towards that person somehow being independent and self-sufficient. More and more, I think, is going to become very obvious that there is no such thing as self-sufficiency. It's an illusion. None of us are self-sufficient. We are all completely interdependently reliant on one another. And what it looks like to have dignity and contribute is going to change very, very rapidly. And if we don't update our assumptions and our value system, we are going to see a lot of people suffer unnecessarily based on those beliefs, just simply based on the belief that a person's economic individual production is their value. That has to change. And so in 5 years, what I'd like to see is narrative change. We have to, I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't think any of us can even remotely imagine what it's going to look like, but it's going to require us to think differently about ourselves and each other.
I want to remind you, we will have some time for questions. So if you've got some, jot them down, and in the next 7-8 minutes, we'll be turning to you. 5 years from now, Sean.
So I'm looking at the title of ours. For me, it would be that no matter where somebody is working, I never hear someone say, that's not my job or that's not my problem. Because everybody needs to have some level of accountability for the issues that people are struggling with, because ultimately it will affect them, right? Every emergency department, every school, every behavioral health provider should be concerned if somebody doesn't have adequate housing, is struggling with some sort of a mental health issue or an income issue, and they should be either incentivized, paid, or held accountable for reaching across the street to a provider that can support that person with that need. So my hope is that in 5 years, no matter where anybody is, they are paying attention to all of those needs and they're linking arms with other providers and other people that can support that person for that need.
You know, it feels like for a lot of the world, COVID was a time of real isolation, right? We were separated from each other. And some people really kind of liked it, give me this remote work, I'm gonna stick this out for the rest of my life, I don't ever have to go into the office. And then we started to realize that our culture suffers, our mental health suffers when we are not with other human beings. I'm a big dog person, and dogs travel in packs. I think humans do too, and we need to. And so take a lesson from our dogs, right, Matt? Take a lesson from our dogs. But I feel like that the tide is shifting a little bit, and we are beginning to see our need for community. Mm-hmm. And in many sessions throughout, that reference to being in community is kicking in. So I'm kind of hopeful that it will impact the sector as well, or that the sector could perhaps drive the rest of the sectors in that direction. Help us out with words, okay? Because there's a shifting language in this arena. And it truly used to be homeless. Then we started to talk about unhoused and housing insecure. And a couple people have said to me, it's all euphemism. Homeless is homeless, but it's not. Mm-hmm. Each of those words has special connotation. And it would probably be useful for us to understand what's the vocabulary and what is the power inside of that vocabulary. Aubrey, give it a shot.
Yeah, I use housing insecure a lot because when people think of homeless, they think of the person on the street corner who's sleeping under the bridge. But there's such a huge continuum of what that looks like. So going home to a home that's not accessible, also housing insecure. Not being able to get your wheelchair up the ramp, and so you're trying to scoot up to the door, that's not appropriate housing for someone who's struggling. You might be couch surfing, and is that really how someone wants to live, right? Or is couch surfing really just another part of homelessness, right? That you don't have a home that you own or a place that you can call your head in permanency. And so that's why we have different words that we've used over time. Housing insecure, I think, one, kind of lifts people's eyes a little bit to say, what is that? And allows us to explain a little bit more that, again, it could be you, and it's much broader than someone who's sleeping under a bridge, and that's the connotation we have with homelessness.
So it really is the more inclusive language. Ryan?
Yeah, I think this goes back to stories and narratives, and I think part of the reason we swap out terms sometimes is just because of the stigma that gets attached to a term that then causes a person, when they hear the word homeless as opposed to unhoused or housing insecure, to have a reaction that comes with a lot of assumptions around what to do about it, why the person's in that situation, et cetera. I think it's important to go beyond just what are we calling the person who's been most failed by the problem and look at the whole problem, right? So really think about what's the impact on people who are not unhoused, who are not homeless, that are spending 40 to 60% of their gross income on rent. And what's that impact on their household, on our local economy? Why do we see people who are unhoused when we think about it from the framework of that person has failed, not thinking about, well, if you have a couple 100,000 people, no matter how wealthy your surrounding local community is, when you have a couple 100,000 people who are rent burdened, there are going to be emergency situations that spiral and cause people to lose their basic stability. And so, and I think we talked about this prior, we use funny math for this too. When we talk about the concept of rent burden, we tend to talk about it based on what current federal policy determines as sustainable rents, which typically is calculated as roughly a third of somebody's gross income. And we don't always do the math of, well, wait a minute, let's set aside only rents. Let's also look at the inaffordability beyond rent, and then think about that when we're talking about somebody who's at a percentage of the AMI that a third of their income isn't enough to pay their rent, that the remaining 2/3 is actually not very much money because you're talking about somebody who's already in that place. So even when you talk about it from the lens of housing, really what we're just talking about is economic strife, and that we aren't meeting people's needs, and we're looking at those pieces of it in isolation instead of de-siloing it and recognizing we're looking at whole people, and we can't expect people at large to succeed when they're so deeply under-resourced.
Anything to add, Sean?
I think just that the way I would frame it, similar to Aubrey and Ryan's response, is that housing is sort of a continuum, right? And let's start with the assumption that having quality, affordable, stable housing is a right and a basic need that everybody should have. And the absence of that becomes a spectrum, and we often talk about homelessness where somebody absolutely does not have a house and is that person on the corner sleeping under the bridge as the only extreme that we need to be concerned about, when in truth, it's really a spectrum. And that spectrum goes from that extreme end to being housing burdened, to not having accessible housing that somebody has, to being precariously housed, couch surfing, so on and so forth. And what we need is policy and supports that address that whole spectrum so that everybody has access to that basic need, that basic right, which is quality, stable, affordable housing.
I want to say, even those who are not rent burdened are still rent burdened. When housing is extremely inaffordable, it's impacting everybody's ability to do anything else. And I think that at the core of a situation where we're seeing increasing numbers of people losing their housing, we're not necessarily recognizing that this is just the most acute effect of something much larger. And we're slowly starting to realize that. We used to talk about NIMBYism. We used to talk about not in my backyard. Now everybody wants affordable housing in their communities because they can't house their workforce,
right,
and support businesses to support high-income people in their communities. So that's not necessarily a good thing, but at least that's helping us destigmatize the problem and start looking more holistically at solutions.
Well, now I'm turning my burden of questions over to you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Go for it, Matt.
You know what I'm going to ask. So thanks to my member of my board of directors So between 1 in 10 to 1 in 4 people experiencing homelessness have a pet, but won't seek help if they means being separated from their pet.
Sure.
So how do you handle that?
Who wants to jump at that first?
I can jump first. So we offer a full continuum that ranges from transitional housing to permanent housing and significant prevention services. In our transitional housing, we will accept the pet. We actually just opened another 8-bed spot that we are not able to accept pets at, but have a relationship with a local resource that will help hang on to that pet temporarily. And that's for seniors who are basically continuing through our ER. They also won't go to the ER often because they have a pet. And so we're trying to be this kind of preventive mechanism there. And then in our affordable housing sites, we allow pets there as well.
Yeah, and same. We see pets as family. It's critical to people's well-being in a lot of cases. And as you note, it's a barrier to people seeking affordable, stable housing. So we make sure and include pets.
I guess I'll just add, check out, I mean, maybe it was last week's Metro Mode article on the collaboration between the Alliance for Housing in Oakland County and Oakland County on essentially trying to remove that barrier and ensuring that anybody who's concerned about what will be the fate of or the future of their beloved pet if they were to enter shelter or other services, that they will be cared for temporarily until permanent housing is secured and everyone can be back together again.
See, our belief at Michigan Humane is you got to take care of both ends of the leash. So thank you for that. Yeah. Other questions? Well, I'm going to ask one final question. And I think in the spirit of a group of people who want to go home with their to-do list and action items, what is one thing you would ask of this group to do on the other side of this conversation? What one thing can they do that would help you and help this issue the most? And I'll work my way this way, starting with you, Ryan.
Oh, boy. I think we see a tendency to deprioritize some of the most important humanitarian challenges that we have in our communities because solutions feel out of reach, because you have a limited pool of resources, whether they're philanthropic, whether they're local governmental resources, and you say, this isn't enough to remotely make a dent in the scale of human need that we have. And so maybe that means it's not our calling to respond to that need. Maybe we should respond to other needs in our community and make other investments in our community. And the problem with that is it compounds. And when everybody's thinking that way, we're even more deeply under-resourced to respond to human needs. So I would just simply ask those in the room to keep humanitarian needs, keep hunger, homelessness, and the most basic needs of your neighbors at the top of your priority list. And reach out to local organizations that are working on those issues to say, how can my resources be leveraged? Maybe I don't have the resources to respond to what I view as a scale of the need, but if I could provide you with some resource, how might you be able to leverage that resource to do more for people?
Aubrey?
Be our advocates. I think what people don't realize is that the time frame from conceptualization of a new affordable housing project to actual lease up is 4 years with a really good project. And that's meaning you get funding with your first application. It can often be decades. And so when we're looking, we know there's an affordable housing crisis. I used to say it was pending. It's not pending. It is there. It is approaching all of our communities. And this space that Ryan was talking about, where really it's not 30% of area median income. It's significantly higher. And that's going to be a challenge for all of our communities. So the solution isn't in building affordable housing. We don't have time for the solution to be just building affordable housing. It's preventing folks from hitting the crisis, the $400 crisis that Sean talked about, that takes them to the streets or takes them to couch surfing. So how can we be in this preventative space and invest community resources in preventing evictions and supporting independence in spaces where people want to live so that we can really create community change before the crisis gets worse?
Sean?
Yeah, I'll give 3 concrete to-dos. Number 1, ask your representatives at the state level to support the state housing tax credit legislation. Number 2, ask your federal legislators to support the Excellence in Mental Health Act, which will advance the Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic model. And number 3, feel free to check out the websites for our organizations that are doing good work in this space, MiSide.org, VOA.org, Lighthouse.org, and support
LighthouseMI.org. I couldn't
what
get
I-
Lighthouse.
Lighthouse.
UAMI.org as well.
LighthouseMichigan.org works as well.
Look us up online on Google.
Just Google our
No,
orgs.
support the work of organizations that are doing good work in your neighborhoods and communities.
Perfect note to end on. You guys are great. I so appreciate what you're doing in our community and for humanity. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone.